Solitary and starved, the hidden use of food to control prisoners. For more real crime stories, be sure to subscribe, like, share, and let's discuss your thoughts in the comments. In October 2015, the chilling screams of a prisoner echoed off the cold concrete walls of an isolated cell in the California State Prison, Sacramento. Staff were alerted to the overwhelming smell of decay, but it would be days before anyone ventured inside. When they finally opened the door, they found Paul Duran, his body emaciated and lifeless, having been left to self-isolate for weeks. The coroner's report revealed not just death by malnutrition, but signs of severe psychological distress. The prison's handling of Duran's confinement came into sharp focus, raising urgent questions about the treatment and control measures used within the facility. As the details of Duran's tragic demise began to unfold, so did the shocking revelation that food deprivation had been deliberately used as a mechanism for punishment. What had happened to Duran in those isolated weeks? Why had no one intervened? These questions hung like a heavy fog over the prison, brewing a storm that threatened to expose a deeply flawed system. With a public outcry soon to follow, investigative journalists began digging deep into the case. They uncovered a disturbing pattern: reports of starvation tactics used on several inmates in solitary confinement. Duran's story was not unique. It was the tip of an iceberg that revealed a profound darkness behind prison walls. The urgency to unravel the truth increased as advocates and families of inmates called for justice, but what awaited them was far more complex than anyone could imagine. Before we dive deeper into the full extent of this tragic case, we must first understand who Paul Duran was, a man whose life marked a tragic intersection of mental health struggles and a penal system ill-equipped to address them. The road leading to his confinement began long before that fatal moment, filled with its own warning signs. Paul Duran was born in 1982 to a troubled family in Los Angeles, California. From a young age, he faced overwhelming challenges, including the shadows of poverty and an unstable home life where addiction and abuse reigned. Paul struggled academically and was diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety by his early teens. In his mid-20s, seeking solace, he turned to drugs, becoming increasingly entangled in a web of addiction that ultimately led to his criminal convictions. His sporadic criminal offenses would evolve into a longer-term sentence for drug-related crimes. In 2011, Paul was incarcerated, and while behind bars, he became a ghost of his former self. Prison documents reflect a troubling journey. Concerns about his mental state were flagged repeatedly, yet the system largely ignored them. Instead of receiving adequate mental health care, he was placed in solitary confinement after an altercation with another inmate. The isolation that followed would prove detrimental. Solitary confinement, initially designed for disciplinary purposes, evolved into a Kafkaesque nightmare. Studies show that individuals confined to isolation suffer from increased anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts, and these effects are compounded by food deprivation. For Paul, it wasn't long before his mental health deteriorated dramatically. As the weeks turned into months, the prison staff allegedly began restricting access to food as added punishment. Duran had become a target, stripped of security and vulnerability exploited. His daily caloric intake plummeted, and soon he was left with mere scraps and moldy bread, a cruel tactic disguised as discipline. Reports from fellow inmates paint a haunting picture. Paul would shuffle back to his cell during meal times, either not receiving meals or being given items that barely constituted food. As advocates began to piece together Paul's story, they found numerous red flags were raised, yet ignored, within the prison. Families of other inmates began speaking out about similar experiences, drawing a stark parallel to Duran's plight. But the prison administration remained unresponsive, arguing that restrictive food measures were necessary for maintaining order. The situation escalated when a journalist secured access to talk to inmates who had witnessed Duran's decline. They shared harrowing accounts of the moments leading up to his death, culminating in the alarming outcry that reverberated through the community. An atmosphere of desperation settled in as these voices emerged from the silence. Yet, Just as tension began to escalate, the prison administration launched a counteroffensive, denying all claims and labeling the inmates as unreliable witnesses. Their rebuttal only heightened suspicions. Was there a cover-up? Advocates began to mount pressure, demanding transparency and immediate investigations into the living conditions. As more evidence appeared, the implications grew increasingly serious. Advocacy groups rallied around Paul's family, demanding an independent investigation into his treatment. While the public began mobilizing, Paul Duran's death came to symbolize the systemic failures within the penal system, issues of mental health, isolation, and hunger being weaponized against inmates who had already suffered too much. With the spotlight now shining brightly on California's prison system, the next steps would prove paramount. Would the dying echoes of Paul Duran's life bring about the needed reforms? Or would the powers that be continue their indifference, sheltering an all-too-common cycle of abuse? This looming uncertainty hung heavily in the air, casting a long shadow over justice for not just Duran's fate, but for countless others who remained unheard. As the investigation into Paul Duran's death gained momentum, shocking revelations began to surface about the practices employed in solitary confinement across various prisons in California. A sweeping examination of records revealed a troubling pattern. Documents detailing inmates deprived of food, denied medical attention, and left in isolation without justification. Advocacy groups pounced on these findings, arguing that not just Paul's death, but a series of tragedies represented an urgent call for immediate reforms. Families of other inmates soon began to rally their voices, sharing their experiences with the grim realities of life behind bars. Maria Lopez, the sister of another inmate, stepped into the spotlight. "My brother was left without food for days. It's abuse disguised as discipline," she stated passionately in a community meeting aimed at addressing prison reform. As public outrage mounted, local news teams began reporting more extensively on Paul's story, linking it with broader discussions about prison conditions nationwide. The media frenzy brought in outside experts who weighed in on the psychological impact of punitive measures like food deprivation on inmates, asserting that these practices violate human rights guidelines established by international bodies. Yet the prison system was caught in a whirlwind. In a surprising move, the administration announced a new policy. Prisoners in isolation would now receive a minimum caloric intake to ensure basic well-being. However, advocates remained skeptical, wondering if this change would be more than just a public relations stunt. Amidst this chaos, a critical piece of evidence emerged. A whistleblower from within the prison system provided eyewitness accounts, detailing the disturbing practices that typically went unreported. In a confidential interview, the whistleblower recounted being ordered to withhold food from certain inmates as a form of control and punishment. This revelation sent shockwaves through the building investigation, providing the evidence needed to substantiate the claims of inhumane treatment. As the days went by, Paul Duran's case evolved from a tragic story into a potential catalyst for reform. Behind bars, the situation within the prison grew increasingly fraught. Inmates felt emboldened by the media coverage and began speaking out more fervently about their own experiences. But this newfound courage came with peril. Whispers of retaliation seeped through the prison walls as guards maintained a watchful eye. Tensions peaked when advocates organized a public rally outside the prison, demanding justice for Paul and other inmates experiencing similar abuses. The visibility was created for the plight of those trapped in a system that often disregarded their humanity. However, as the rally gained momentum, tragedy struck once more, with reports emerging that an inmate had mysteriously collapsed during a routine lockdown, raising questions about health conditions and care within the prison. The echo of that collapse was not simply an isolated incident. It sounded the alarm that prison officials could not ignore any longer. As the public continued to demand answers, condemnation reached new heights, forcing higher-level officials to finally respond to the long-standing issues plaguing the facility. Paul Duran's life and death had become a symbol for institutional problems that ran deep. The notion of food as a weapon and control shattered preconceived notions of justice, and advocates stood poised to hold the system accountable. Would justice prevail for Paul and others like him? Would the changes have any real impact or fade into mere empty promises? In a world where meals were used as tools for punishment, the stakes had never been higher. As the rallying cries for justice grew louder, the resolution hung in the balance, ready to unfold as the future of the prison system loomed precariously ahead.